Hello, welcome to Thor Talk, the show all about Marvel's resident god of thunder. On this episode of Thor Talk, Thor and Loki come to Utgard-Hall and find themselves face to face with an elder god, the Utgard-Loki. Utgard-Loki is very mysterious, but he makes one thing explicitly clear. The fate of their worlds rests on what they accomplish here in Utgard-Hall. They must overcome the impossible, or everything ends. We'll see if their worlds remain standing on Thor Talk.
I am Thor the Thunderer, son of Odin, prince of Asgard, and this world is under my protection.
The Immortal Thor number 7 was written by Al Ewing and was published in February of 2024. The issue begins with a quote from Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda in the Gulfaginning section. "That will indeed be a feat," said Utgard-Loki, "if thou performest what thou promisest, and it shall be tried forthwith." The quote is from the section that describes the myth of Utgard-Loki's tests, which is also the myth that this comic is based on. When Thor and his companions arrive in Utgard-Loki's hall, Utgard-Loki says that no one can stay in the hall unless they can perform some great feat better than all others. Loki steps forward first and says that he can eat faster than anyone else, and he would be able to defeat anyone in an eating contest. The quote at the beginning of the issue is Utgard-Loki's response to Loki's assertion. Utgard-Loki says here that it would be impressive if Loki could indeed defeat anyone here in an eating contest, because he intends to put Loki against an opponent who is impossible to defeat: fire itself. Of all the quotes placed at the beginning of these issues of the Immortal Thor, this one is by far the most straightforward. It was chosen because it is from the original myth, and because in this comic, Utgard-Loki intends to test Thor and Loki in impossible tasks, just as his mythological counterpart did. The story begins with Thor and Loki wading through thick fog. It has grown so dense that they can no longer see Skrymir, the giant they were following. So they close their eyes to better hear the sound of his monstrous footsteps. And when they open their eyes, they see it at last: Utgard-Hall. Upon seeing this enormous, imposing fortress, Loki tries to get Thor to turn back, but Thor reprimands him, saying they must find out what lurks behind these doors, and report it to the Allfather. Thor hopes that then his father will start treating them like gods, and not just troublesome striplings. Thor's pride is at stake, but Utgard-Hall is no place for pride. Just to enter he must crawl on his belly, and when he rises, he is greeted by an elder god, who appears to be made of magic itself.
"If I do not mistake me, that stripling there must be Asa Thor. Welcome, Shadow Thunderer. My name you will never know, nor will any until the hour of my death. But you may know me as the Utgard-Loki."
This is the first time that Thor sees Utgard-Loki, and really it's the first time that we as readers get a good look at him. I really do love the design, as he looks like he's made of magic itself, with bones that make up a robe and horns resembling Loki's. Utgard-Loki also reveals that Utgard-Loki is not his real name, but a title. That makes sense since Tornos was the Utgard-Thor, but Utgard-Loki says his real name will never be revealed until the hour of his death. This not only makes me really curious what his real name is, but adds a further layer of mystery around the character. In fact, this issue does a great job of making Utgard-Loki feel ancient, mysterious, and powerful. He knows ancient secrets from the beginning, and even knows about his own death. He really feels like a god amongst gods, towering over the sons of Odin. Thor intended to prove his worth by entering the Utgard-Hall, but he is humbled by Utgard-Loki at every turn. Thor crawls on his belly to enter the hall. Thor sets out to prove that he was not a troublesome stripling to his father, but Utgard-Loki refers to Thor as a stripling the moment he sees him. He also calls him the Shadow Thunderer, as a reference to the fact that Thor is only a shadow of his counterpart, Tornos. As I mentioned in the last video, the myth of Utgard-Loki's trials was also adapted in Thor number 272, so we'll be looking at some differences between the three versions throughout. Thor number 272 and the Immortal Thor number 7 are mostly the same at this point, with the only real difference being Utgard-Loki having a vastly different design and overall seeming less powerful in Thor number 272. The Immortal Thor has more plans for Utgard-Loki, so the extra effort in his design and dialogue makes sense. Both comics differ from the myth in the number of people present. Thor and Loki are accompanied by Thor's human servants, Thjolvi and Roskva in the myth, whereas they are absent in both comic versions. Furthermore, Utgard-Loki was not the only person in his hall, but had many very large Jotnar with him. In both comic versions, it is just Utgard-Loki alone in his hall. In order to stand upon Utgard's ground, they must pass Utgard's trials. Thor must demonstrate whether he is merely the small god he appears to be, or his mother's son. Thor begins to decline as the sons of Odin do not engage in petty contests, but Loki interjects and says he wants to have an eating contest. Loki has been complaining about how hungry he's been since the very beginning of their journey. This will allow him to finally get something to eat, but Thor reprimands his brother for not taking this seriously. Utgard-Loki says that this is indeed a serious matter, for they have come as representatives of their own realms. If they cannot endure, then they are unworthy of survival. And if that is the case, what can be said of Asgard, of Jotunheim, of Midgard? I have barely set foot in the Midgard realm.
Yet you rise to defend it so quickly. Why is that? Do you know yet, small Thor?
The terms are set, and the fate of worlds will be decided. Loki jokes that maybe they should make Thor be in a drinking contest then, and Utgard-Loki agrees to this. This is a huge departure from both Thor number 272 and the original myth. In Thor number 272, Utgard-Loki demands that the gods prove themselves worthy or else they'll be thrown in the dungeons. In the myth, Thor's group is in need of a place to stay, and Utgard-Loki says they may only stay in Utgard if they can perform a feat better than all others. Here, the stakes are much higher. It is not their freedom or hospitality on the line, but the fate of 3 worlds. Also, I loved seeing Thor's reaction to Utgard-Loki threatening Midgard. He hasn't spent much time on Earth at this point, and he doesn't know that Gaia is his mother right now, but he feels an instinctual desire to protect the Earth. I also like how Utgard-Loki constantly adds references to Thor's mother throughout. It's now clear that Utgard-Loki didn't summon Thor on a whim, but because of who his mother is. Utgard-Loki then summons a table adorned with a magnificent feast. A horn soon appears in Thor's hand that is larger than his axe. Thor must drink all the mead in the horn, and Loki must eat faster than his opponent. Loki suspects that he will be going up against a large giant, so he immediately starts to eat, but his opponent is much smaller than expected. His name is Loki, and he doesn't talk. Sometimes he spits. As he begins to drink, Thor wonders if these trials are purely ceremonial since they appear to be so easy. The truth becomes more apparent as the foul-tasting mead reaches his lips. He spits it out in disgust, but the horn must be drained. Loki has no trouble in his task until his opponent begins to eat not just all the food, but the table itself. Loki admits defeat as the table goes down Loki's throat. Thor continues to struggle to drink, and at last collapses in defeat. Despite his effort, the horn is nearly full, whereas Utgard-Loki claims to have drained the horn in 3 long swallows at the formation of the world. Yet Thor still endures, and demands that Utgard-Loki bring on the next trial. Of the 3 versions of the story, the Immortal Thor is the only version to have Thor notice how bad the mead tastes. The mead is secretly the ocean itself, but in Thor number 272 and the original myth, Thor doesn't seem to notice that he is drinking literal salt water. Still, the overall result is the same in all 3 versions, with Thor taking several attempts but failing to do anything more than slightly lower the level of the liquid in the horn. One very big difference is how the horn is presented. In the Immortal Thor, Utgard-Loki says that he drank the whole thing in 3 large swallows at the formation of the world. This emphasizes Utgard-Loki's own power and ancientness, but the myth instead emphasizes Thor's supposed weakness. Utgard-Loki says that any good drinker can finish the horn in 1 gulp, An average man may do it in 2, but only the most pathetic of drinkers would need 3 gulps to finish it. Thor takes 3 large gulps and barely lowers it. Thor's struggles are observed by Dario Agger, thanks to the magic of Amora the Enchantress. But while they are merely observing, they can do more. In Utgardhall, Loki hears something, but Thor is eager to get back to the story. For the next contest, Loki will participate in a race, and he plans to use magic boots to win. His opponent is a mischievous-looking child named Hugi. No, wait, it's actually Loki. Loki, who easily defeats Loki before he can even move. As he's telling the story, Loki notes that Hugi, not Loki, was his opponent in the original story. He wonders if someone is turning his magic upon him, but the story must be finished regardless. So it seems like the Enchantress is altering the story. In Thor number 272 and the original myth, the racing opponent is Hugi, but here is a new character named Loki. Hugi is Old Norse for thought, because that's exactly what he is. I couldn't find too much information on the name Loki, but it seems to be a Finnish variant of a name meaning luck or happiness. It could also just be intended to look similar to Loki's name. Unlike other changes, this one seems to be an intentional alteration, and even Loki notices this. Loki resembles Loki's God of Stories appearance in many ways. Loki is described as mischievous, is missing a tooth, and is barefoot. Also, it's worth mentioning that in the original myth, Thor's human servant Thjalfi races Hugi. But in both comic versions, it's Loki, not Thjalfi. Thor finds himself in a wrestling contest with an old woman, and he's losing badly. Utgard-Loki's elderly nurse, Elli, is effortlessly restraining Thor. Utgard-Loki tells him he must make her yield. Or perhaps he may need to yield himself. Thor's very life seems to be being drained from him, but he will not yield. Utgard-Loki tells Elli to release him, for Thor cannot truly yield if he is dead. Thor once again rises and says he will never yield with all that is at stake. So Utgard-Loki gives him his final task. Lift that cat. Thor knew at this point that this would not be as easy as it looked. As he lifts the cat's body, it stretches out. Its fur turns to scales. Its paws become claws. Its teeth become enormous fangs eager to devour the Thunder God. At last, all is revealed. Skrymir the giant was Utgard-Loki in disguise, and Utgard-Loki is the deep magic itself. The knot on Skrymir's bag that the gods couldn't open was the thread of eternity's own fate. When Thor tried to kill Skrymir, Utgard-Loki put a mountain peak in the way, which soon became a valley. Logi was fire itself, which consumes and devours everything. Loki was Loki's own thought, which races ahead of each action. The horn Thor drank from was the sea, and Thor drank so much that it became low tide. The elderly woman was death itself, and the cat was Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, said to be the end of Thor. But even when faced with his own end, Thor refuses to yield. Seeing that Thor will not surrender, Utgard-Loki judges that the current gods are worthy to rule the cosmos for now. But in a future age, the wheel may turn, and catastrophe will follow if the gate to Utgard is unlatched again. With that, he dispels the enchantment, and Utgardhall disappears. Thor and Loki find themselves in Asgard again, and so they go home. The end. Most of the story is the same in all 3 versions, but there are some interesting changes here as well. In the myth, Skrymir's bag was secretly tied with iron, which is why Thor could not untie it. And in Thor number 272, the bag was sealed with magic that no god or giant could undo. Here is the thread of fate of eternity. This change helps tie the story to the Marvel Universe and shows how powerful Utgard-Loki is. In the myth in Thor number 272, Elli is old age itself, but here it is death. This also ties the story into Marvel, since death appears to be Mistress Death. There is also a difference in the order of the tasks. In the myth and Thor number 272, lifting the cat comes before wrestling the old woman. However, in the Immortal Thor, the cat is the last task. This is because the purposes of the tests are very different. In the myth, the purpose of the test is to intimidate Thor so that he will not attempt to enter Utgard again. Remember, Thor is the slayer of the Jotnar, and they are terrified of him. So Utgard-Loki hopes to convince Thor that he is so inferior to them that he shouldn't come after them. He tells Thor that only the most pathetic of drinkers in his land would need 3 gulps to finish the horn. He says lifting his cat is a task meant for children. And he has Thor wrestle an old woman because everyone else there would think it's beneath them to wrestle someone so weak. However, Utgard-Loki reveals that he was bluffing, and his plan backfires since Thor comes close to completing all 3 tasks, which should be impossible. In the Immortal Thor, the goal is not to intimidate Thor, but to test him, to see if he can endure when faced with impossible tasks. Thor does endure, and this proves that he is worthy. This is why the cat is last here, because each task increases in how much it should be difficult to endure. The first task is simply an obstacle that cannot be overcome. The second is a task that may kill Thor if he continues. And the final task is one that will kill Thor. Jormungandr isn't just another threat. It is Thor's fated doom. It's not a death he can avoid, so his refusal to yield shows true courage, and it is enough to convince Utgard-Loki that the gods deserve to live along with their worlds. Of course, he does hint at a future day when things may change, and we've seen that begin to play out. Now that Loki's tale is finished, Thor knows that he can no longer delay his meeting with Gaia. He must confront his mother and find out why she unleashed the Utgard gods upon Midgard. But there is another issue that gnaws at him. There is an Utgard-Loki. There is an Utgard-Thor, but are there more? Somewhere in that forest beyond that gate, is there an Utgard-Odin? This final tease was incredibly exciting, and something I somehow never considered before. I'm a big fan of Odin, so imagining an Utgard-Odin taking the stage is a big deal for me. But I think this Utgard god may be a familiar face. Based on his appearance, the icy realm he dwells in, and the presence of an eagle, the Utgard-Odin is likely none other than Buri, the grandfather of Odin and the first Asgardian god. This makes a ton of sense, since he was the first Allfather, so Odin could be called an imitation of him. Buri has very rarely appeared in Marvel, but we know he is alive and he's already met Thor. He's been exclusively on the side of good, but this issue does seem to set this Utgard-Odin up as a threat. Regardless of how this all plays out, I really loved this issue. The last issue was honestly my least favorite, since it was pretty much just a retelling of a story I've heard twice before. I expected this to be more of the same since it's the second part of the story, but this issue makes several interesting changes and teases that kept me invested. Maybe that was Ewing's plan all along, to lower my expectations then hit me with this. Ewing's elder gods are an intimidating threat, but also full of secrets that draw me in. I want to know what Utgard-Loki's real name is just as much as I want to see how Thor will defeat him. Honestly, I don't think I've ever been this excited for the rest of a Thor story to come out, and the next issue is probably the one I'm most excited for, as Thor will finally confront Gaia. It's going to be great. Well, that's all for this episode of Thor Talk. I hope it was to your liking. It ended up being a bit longer than I thought, but if you've stuck around to watch all this, I appreciate it, genuinely. I've been loving this series, and I hope you all have been too. It's a good time to be a Thor fan, my friends. With that being said, see you next time on Thor Talk, where...
You behold in breathless wonder